Live from the mist-enshrouded mountaintop fortress that is X and Y Communications headquarters, you're listening to the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. And now, here's your host, Scot McKay.
Greetings, gentlemen. Welcome once again to yet another episode of the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. My name is Scot McKay, at Scot McKay on both Twitter and Clubhouse. Hope you'll join us every Monday at 8:30 Eastern. That's GMT -4 on Clubhouse. And you can also find me on Instagram at Real Scot McKay. Scot McKay is what you search on YouTube to get to our video content. And you can also, as always, visit us on the web at mountaintoppodcast.com. And on Facebook, you can join our Facebook group full of men who are interested in being better men in general and also getting better women in their life by searching Mountaintop Summit on Facebook. With me today is a new friend of mine. He is the author and publisher of Change Makers Books, which is all about personal and social transformation. So we're already on the right foot there. But he is a very interesting and successful cat in that he is actually publishing other self-help and social transformation types. So he's kind of the ringleader of the whole group of authors there. He hails from Bethesda, Maryland, home of Walter Reed Medical Center and a whole bunch of other governmental and research and top secret-ish kind of things. Bethesda, Maryland's always talked about on the FBI shows on TV, right? But that's where Tim Ward is from. And indeed, he is my guest today. And he is the author of a book of his own called, here, check this out, Savage Breast. See what he did there? One Man's Search for the Goddess. So without anything further, Tim, welcome to the show, man.
Scott, I'm so glad to be your guest and to meet all your listeners.
Yeah, man, I'm sure they're going to be very, very happy to meet you too, because what we're going to talk about today is one of those deep cerebral topics that is really a lot of fun to dig into for smart guys and really is something that we all should spend more time thinking about. Because you and I were discussing the premise of your book, the central theme behind it, despite its kind of, I don't want to call it esoteric, but it has an indeed sort of spiritually guided title, seeing as how it has the word goddess in it. But as we were discussing, the premise of the book is, masculinity and femininity are designed to be together, designed to kind of be this yin yang thing, whereby we get along and we're in partnership. Yet so often, masculinity and femininity kind of are at odds with each other. And we don't understand women. They don't understand us. And there's got to be some kind of disconnect that goes on there that keeps us from really understanding each other when we were meant to be together. And of course, we know there are a lot of angry women, and they find themselves in echo chambers formed amongst themselves to really bash men. And the men respond to that with a whole woman bashing group, and they're no darn good, and they're going to take all your money and steal your children from you. You'll never see them again, and they're just going to trade you in on a richer guy. And we really get into this mess where we don't trust the other gender. And it's often because we don't understand that other gender or we misunderstand that other gender. So I would love for you to just go off on a rant or a riff or whatever you want to call it and tell us about what drove you really to put this book together and fill in the gaps for me on the central premises of it.
Scott, my pleasure. So when I was in my early 40s, I'd been married, divorced, and was deeply in love with a woman and was working on making this work. We both really loved each other. It was a beautiful relationship, but I found myself really unable to commit in a way that was weird. And what often would happen to me is I'd feel like I'd come back to this place in a relationship again, but it's familiar. It's a pattern. Again and again, I'm coming back here. And I'm about to really mess things up. And to me, this recognition of a pattern is a clue that there's something going on in our subconscious mind, in the big mind that each of us have beneath our daily thoughts. And because I'd read a fair amount of Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, I had this some understanding of the unconscious mind. And when it comes to the feminine, Jung had a very interesting theory, the idea that there was an inner feminine inside of men called the anima and an inner masculine inside of women called the animus. And part of what attracted someone to the opposite sex is you see an image of that inner unconscious feminine inside of you in the external woman that you love. And loving her is in a way triggers that piece, which is why you might say, you complete me, or I looked at her and it was love at first sight, or I've been searching for you all my life. All those sort of things that you romantically will hear men say, and frankly, women say too, when they find their ideal male complement. So I took this notion of Jung's and added to it an observation that he made, that this feminine has archetypes. There are different ways that the feminine can express itself. And in Western societies, we all too often have had those impoverished because all of the sacred feminine archetypes disappeared except Mary, the Virgin Mother goddess. And man, for me, that really hit home, because one of the things that I was running up against in previous relationships is I would love a woman, but as soon as I fell in love with her, our sex life would fall apart. So I felt that I was having this sort of Jungian crisis. What to do, that the anima that I'm attracted to doesn't seem to be the woman that I then can live with. And Scott, that sort of got me to the start of this book.
So the first question I have for you is, can you clarify for us how Western culture is intimately associated with this virgin goddess mother in particular?
Sure. So obviously everybody who had a religious upbringing is familiar with Mary, the mother of Jesus, right? And by the way, I'm not a religious person right now in my life and haven't been for some time. So I approach all of this in an archetypal, psychological lens rather than a spiritual or religious one. Whatever your individual's listeners may be, whatever their theology, it doesn't in a sense matter. To me, this is about finding the pieces of our unconscious architecture that are triggering us. What I also realized, because I spent time traveling in the Far East, is that in Asia, there are actually plenty of goddesses. You go to any Hindu temple in India, and you'll see, Kali and Sati and Durga and Lakshmi. There's all kinds of goddesses. So it struck me as weird that all of our goddesses disappeared in the Western world and were replaced, when Christianity became the monotheistic religion, were replaced by this one singular figure of a woman. So I thought, well, have we in fact been impoverished because we don't see all the different archetypes of the feminine? We've kind of got this limited lens. I mean, the best we can do is like the Spice Girls, right? There's Sporty Spice and there's Ginger Spice and Scary Spice. That's just a tiny pale reflection of these actual very different archetypes of women that the old Greek goddesses and many goddesses before them used to offer to men.
That's a fascinating observation, because in my practice, I find a lot of guys don't know who they're looking for. They want her to be hot and sweet and not take me for a ride or be psychotic, but they don't know anything else about the kind of woman they really want. Just a couple days ago, I had business to do, and behind the counter was stereotypical pretty redhead. And she had the redhead personality, absolutely, almost laughably stereotypically. And yet, that is an archetype, isn't it? The redheaded woman has this certain personality type. And, as dangerous as it can be to stereotype people, sometimes knowing there are different types of people and they may fit into these different categories helps us at least figure out who is out there, and perhaps even more importantly, figure out what our preferences are so that we're choosing the kind of woman we want instead of settling for the person we don't. Because I tell these guys all the time, Tim, the only thing worse than settling for someone is being settled for. And then your relationship dynamics are awful in the way that you just described. So you also mentioned here that, importantly, other parts of the world, based on their cultural heritage and religious heritage, sometimes it's not even religious, it's in fact just cultural. Perhaps there are equal measures of religious and or purely cultural elements driving it. Men's view on women and women's view on men, or masculinity and femininity and how they interact, has a much broader, or at least different, scope than the lens we're used to looking through here in the Western world. And that may be to our discredit. So it's certainly worth looking at. And that's why I'm so excited about your book and this conversation today. Now, one thing that comes to mind after you spoke is we really don't have a religious ladies' man, do we, in Christianity? because, fornication and stuff, right? And Jesus Christ himself didn't ever marry and bear children, for theologically obvious reasons. But you start looking at the Hindu faith, or various representations of the Hindu faith. Anybody who's ever been to India, which I'm sure you have, figures out very quickly that India is far from uniform in any way, shape, or form. Even the Hindu religion is sort of it has a lot of less dogmatic features than, say, conservative fundamentalist Christianity would have. But one recurring figure throughout most of Hinduism is Krishna, and Krishna is a ladies' man. Mm-hmm. And the women just love him. So therefore, you are presented with almost, well, it isn't even almost, in their mind, it's a divine representation of a guy who's good with women. And we just don't have that. But, for purposes of your book and what we're talking about here in the conversation, it is very useful. It is very useful to point out that much of the rest of the world has a masculine representation that has at least been in some way, shape, or form deified, that serves as a roadmap on how to get women. And we don't have that here, do we?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so talk about what we're missing out on, man. What are these guys in India and China and the Buddhist guys? And I don't know, pick a religion. I guess it doesn't really matter. But what are other guys in the world in on that we're not, that we can gain from this show today?
Well, in Savage Breast, I stick mostly to the Greek pantheon. And you have all these Greek gods, all of these Greek goddesses, which does, in a sense, give you not only the archetype of the woman to help you sort of figure out who, what, how do I love, but also how, as a man, do I express that love, whether it's through somebody who's a warrior, or somebody who's a seducer, or someone who's a trickster, or a god like Apollo who's a musician, playing the harp. Well, that archetype's pretty easy to find these days. Seeing it through the lens of the ancient Greeks, to me, gives it, in a sense, first of all, a piece of distance. It allows us to look at what a very different culture does. And that allows, at least it started to allow me to feel what the echoes were from that culture. So when I looked at the goddesses from ancient Greece, I looked, for example, at Hera, the wife figure, the figure of the wife of Zeus, or Demeter, the mother figure, or Aphrodite, the figure of the lover. These are all classic archetypes, but their images in ancient Greek have myths and stories and just plain statues galore that when you go to can start to trigger other things, kind of like a tuning fork. Once you tap that tuning fork, it's amazing what else will start to resonate with it. And so that to me was my desire to go and explore, is to see behind each of these goddesses what was resonating for me with those individual women archetypes, and how was I then responding? What part of my maleness was responding to each of them? Who was I, and who were these different aspects of femininity to me? So that's, to me, where the book got interesting.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a no-brainer to think of the ancient Greek pantheon as a quintessential example of what you're talking about. And indeed, the Roman pantheon later. And another example of that feminine representation would be the Athenian one. I mean, here you have a woman who's the goddess of wisdom. So you have a really high view of women being portrayed there too. They're not just sex objects, a la the goddess of love, Aphrodite. She was certainly more than just a sex object, obviously. I mean, she's deified. But, you have various different representations of women that perhaps we don't consider all that much, or certainly not enough here in Western civilization. And then you get all the works of literature that come from it. In Homer's Odyssey, they're drawn and seduced by the sirens, of course, which is another representation of women. And it just goes on in very meaningful ways for those cultures, right?
Yes, indeed. And I'm so glad, Scott, that you mentioned Athena, because when I really came to Athena, man, that was really triggering me. And I realized that what I really like is this figure of Athena, who's not only wisdom, she's also a warrior. She's also a strong and powerful force. Indeed, she was one of the leading divinities in the War of Troy. I realized that there was something that really drew me to the beauty, of wisdom and strength in women, but at the same time made me uncomfortable. And in looking more deeply at Athena, you see that she's not just a strong and smart woman, but she's also a woman who has shielded herself. She's wearing armor. She's in many ways impenetrable and inaccessible. On the other hand, she's also the daughter of Zeus, and she does Zeus's bidding. So she really is the woman who really you can suddenly jump to today and see she's the woman in the boardroom who may be the CEO, but she's still serving the needs of the corporation. She's having to protect herself from the spears and arrows of others in the room who will try to take her down. She may come across as invulnerable, but she's also aware that there are maybe those out to get her. Seeing these women through this archetypal lens gave me a different, first of all, appreciation for what they might have been going through, but also start to see not just my own attraction, but when you go deeper into these myths, you see that beneath the goddesses as the Greeks understood them, there are many other stories and myths. For example, Athena is actually connected to much older goddesses that are snake goddesses. The snake, of course, being all to do about knowledge, right back from the old tree of good and evil. In the Bible, the serpent has a deep kind of earthy knowledge, very different than the boardroom knowledge of Athena as we see today. So I found each goddess, as I started looking at her, had more stories and more secrets to reveal.
Well, certainly this multi-dimensional outlook on not just women, but at large, femininity in general, is something we can all draw from here in the United States or here in Western culture. Fast forwarding, of course, to today's postmodern culture. We think we got it all figured out. We think we're culturally, technologically advanced. Yet we go back 3,000 or 4,000 years and they have a much better, more complete, panoramic viewpoint is the best way I know how to describe it on all these facets of femininity, including being a smart, powerful, confident, gritty woman that really separate those particular personality traits or those gifts from being a woman or a man. I mean, being smart, mentally tough, wise, powerful aren't necessarily masculinity. They're human virtue, and femininity, therefore, gets deconstructed from that and must therefore mean something else. So what did femininity in particular mean to non-Western cultures even that far back? Go ahead and elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure. I found behind the Greek goddesses, as I said, when I started looking further into it, there are actually thousands of years of prehistory, not with written down myths, but with statues, with temple sites that told a story of the earliest cultures of Europe, which were largely goddess worshipping cultures. You actually see very few artifacts of representations of men, but you see many of women, which has just blew my mind because you don't find that in the history books. So I write about that discovery of the sort of deeper exploration of the feminine in the earliest European civilizations, including statues of women sitting on thrones, large statues of really fat women who today you'd say were obese, but they're presented in ways that seem to exhibit power.
Or fecundity.
Fecundity, but also, hey, in times of scarcity, the fat survive, right? Because they can live for months when there's no food to be drawn from the land.
Right. It's so hard for the American sensibility to comprehend that at one time, or many times, perhaps for most of history, fat has been beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, when you look at how we men have been programmed by the images we're shown, images of beauty, images of fashion, images in pornography, right? We're shown that this is what an attractive woman is supposed to be. Clearly, for the early Europeans, that was not the case. They saw a lot of power in fat, right? It meant survival. It meant fecundity. It meant strength, which also blew my mind because I'm a child of my culture, right? I was like, whoa, what does this even mean? I mean, you actually do find African cultures today that still really celebrate, a woman's roundness as her sensuality. But for the first time, Scott, I felt impoverished because my culture wouldn't show me. It wouldn't show me that. I started seeing so so many threads going back so far in my own history that I was sort of like falling into these earlier and earlier, more silent and more subconscious layers, both of my culture, but also of my own being. And it led me to some ultimately very terrifying goddesses.
Well, interesting. I want to talk about that for sure. But I can't let the water flow under the bridge without acknowledging, if you go look at porn sites, the truth is out there. Men love round women who are shaped like female human beings. Okay. I mean, the reality of sexual attraction for a lot of men, and I mean, not all, of course, is more like baby got back than a 6-pack ab commercial for a lot of guys. I mean, we like women with curves and roundness to them who look healthy and like they could bear children. One thing I found out just recently is if a woman has body fat below 21 or 22%, she's going to have a particularly hard time conceiving. So even primally, we as men look for cues of fertility from women that drive, that really guide the whole nature of sexual attraction to begin with. A lot of it is about fertility. So all of this is stunningly predictable, yet equally stunningly often overlooked, particularly in our culture. The prize is always to be skinny and eat as little as you can, whereas when it comes to sexual attraction, what we really appreciate about each other, I mean, morbid obesity notwithstanding, right? But we do like, ourselves to be a little bit rounder and, well, better fed, from a purely logistical perspective, in order to drive that more subjective sexual attraction. Yeah, but that point kind of stands alone. I just felt like it needed to be said and elaborated upon. Mm-hmm. I am waiting with bated breath to hear about the terrifying features of what you discovered about the goddess.
Yeah, so one of the archetypes of the goddess that's disappeared pretty much from modern Western culture is the death goddess.
Interesting.
In India, they have Kali, the dark goddess who is the goddess of death and destruction. She's got a necklace of skulls around her neck, and she drinks from a skull filled with blood. So that's there in India. Pretty much disappeared from the West, except perhaps in the Wicked Witch, right? So the idea of the witch, or even the hag or the crone, I think for a lot of men, they are repulsed at the thought of a very old woman engaging with them sexually, right? There, I think you also catch that shadow of the fear of the witch, the female that our culture saw as dangerous and practicing magic and having control, and we would just want to put her to death. So the witch or the crone, the old woman, and the thought of having sex with somebody really old would be hideous, right? I have to say I'm now 62. I'm certainly noticing my tastes are changing. But as young men, we think of that and we sort of go, ugh. So these are all reflections of this death goddess that used to be an immensely powerful figure in old mythology.
Wouldn't you leave some room for the purely practical element there that's, she's past her sexual prime? So, I mean, there's something objective going on there, not necessarily this primordial soup of archetypal elements?
Maybe, but I mean, I think lots of us find women attractive who are not ovulating, right?
Well, I'm talking more in terms of, okay, she's 25, she's 35 years old, and she's looking very fertile in general to us, even if she's not ovulating right now, this particular day of the month. But you'll have to pardon me for finding it a little far-fetched to think that there's a reason that's tied to this particular premise of witches and the death goddess that's keeping 20-year-old guys from finding 75-year-old women sexually attractive. Go ahead and clarify that one for me.
Well, you might find disinterest, but it's not disinterest. It's often a sort of a shudder, right? And that's not just because they're feeling neutral and not interested. I think there's something else deeper that may be going on. Can't speak for everybody. But this aspect of the feminine that is horror inspiring was not an easy one to go into and to look at deeply. And yet I've also seen that, not in women looking horrible who've been my lovers, but who have this death aspect, a consuming, because for the death goddess is a consuming goddess. She consumes the male, sort of like a spider consuming its mate, or a praying mantis.
Yes, exactly.
And that's something that brings up a certain kind of terror, which, if that's in the back of you and you're a guy, we don't even have the puzzle pieces to begin to put together to deal with that.
Well, we don't even have the words. I mean, if you look at the term femme fatale, it's French.
Yeah.
That doesn't even translate into English.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And perhaps it might be an area that is so underexplored that we're blind to it. I mean, how many guys get into a relationship, a committed relationship with a woman they know is no darn good for them, is going to ruin their life, cheat on them, is psychotic, not even in our same reality with us, but she looks so good, or she makes us feel so good sometimes that we commit to her when she's going to be the end of us. Is that on the right track, or is that a completely different situation?
No, I think that's there. I would simply say, Scott, that the opposite is also true. You may have a woman who is really a great match for you, and the closer you get, suddenly you may have just an irrational fear. And this is one of the things that I found myself coming up, that she's somehow going to destroy me or consume me, or take my essence from me and leave me a shallow husk of a man, even though she's not doing that. But I'm doing it. That's an archetype at work, right? That's a deep unconscious pattern coming around. So lots of guys find themselves in relationships, and then they just do something and it explodes. If there's a fear under the surface, they're not ever going to have a relationship work until they have found that fear and confronted it.
Now, the idea of that being archetypal is a massive revelation. I mean, that's the takeaway of this whole show. I keep sabotaging my relationships with women because I think they're going to hurt me. And I've been attributing this to my own insecurities or my own worries that women aren't who they say they're going to be. Ergo, the whole gender war, that women are some different and perhaps more evil species than we even are as men. And there's this underlying dread that this woman is going to be the death of me, when really she just wants to be sweet to us and be nice to us and do kind things to us, bear our children, and be a good mom and roll with us and such. And yet now here you come along with just this monumental idea that, hey, you know what? Something is in your soul eating away at you at its very core because of an archetypal, spiritual, psychological, Jungian presence that you've never even known was there. And I'm reminded of, the great work by C.S. Lewis called The Screw Tape Letters, which famously involves an older demon teaching the younger demon in the art of tempting humans and therefore leading them into damnation. And one of the prime tenets of that older demon's teaching is, if we can keep them from even believing we exist, then we own them. We can run roughshod over them because they don't even believe we're there. And therefore, I'm brought back to your thought process here, and I'm now with you. That is terrifying, which is the word you used, and I'm with you 100% on that now. Because if we don't even know what's in our psyche relative to this, and yet it keeps, bubbling up to the surface, affecting our relationships, then we've got to somehow turn what's unconscious into consciousness so that we can, intelligently act upon it, right? What's your solution for that, Tim?
Well, I mean, for me, it was not just going into it, but keeping notes as I was going. I felt many ways that I was kind of like Christopher Columbus. I was exploring a new world, and I was just trying to leave a map for others to get to. I can say I had some really scary experiences. Scary not because things happened, but scary because things were happening inside. I would go and I would find these old statues at museums throughout Europe, and I would sit and I would look at them, and some of them were incredibly beautiful and some of them were very hard to look at for long periods of time, and I just try to let it resonate in me. And then I wrote it And I wrote it down. And I think if anybody who feels something like a resonance when we're having this conversation, the book's a good place to start their own journey. There's not only tons of stuff to read, you can find so much stuff online these days, and you can start thinking of yourself in terms of what might be going on underneath the surface. If you notice you're having patterns, if you notice you get to a certain point and then you pull back in a relationship, or you always find you have ended up at the same place. The relationship has ended like the last one has ended. And you might think, oh, all these women are all the same. It might simply be my archetype keeps replaying itself on top of different women.
So is this archetype tricking us? I mean, are women really okay? They're not out to kill us. They're not all the goddess of death, or certainly they don't want to be, right?
Yeah, I would not say tricking, but I would say it's because we are very unconscious of our archetypes, they tend to act in a sense we're not looking. So you may suddenly discover yourself relating to a woman in the office as a Demeter, as a mother figure. You don't know how that happened, but suddenly you sense maternal feelings from her that might actually be projections from you. Or you may see another woman and she may just totally trigger your Aphrodite, your sex goddess thing. And it's very hard for you to connect with her without that presence being there. But that's what you've laid on top of her. I'm not saying, by the way, women aren't laying their own animus on top of men. That's their deal. Our deal is, can we become aware of when we're doing these projections on top of women? And if there's a pattern, if there's something that keeps trapping us, until you reveal the archetype, you're probably not going to be able to fix it, because the real woman isn't necessarily the problem. The archetype, the deep feminine you're laying on top of her, might be what's stripping you up.
Well, as you were talking, you used that rather loaded term, sex goddess. And that just kind of falls out of our mouth randomly to refer to women who are particularly sexually enticing. But you know what? There's that word tied to it. It's sort of a nod to this archetype, perhaps even unconsciously to us, that there is some divine element to this. And I also want to hark back to what you just said about there are different representations of women in these other cultures and in these other faith-based representations of women as goddesses to choose from. So yeah, I see a certain feminine creature and she strikes me as a mother figure. I see another one and she makes me horny. And another one and I go, man, that's just a cool girl. I mean, she's all woman all the time, but I just really like her. And maybe she goes in the friend zone, or I go and do something with her that's not sexual, whatever, I think that particular archetype is somewhat confusing to a lot of men, that I can actually have a woman, in my life where she's not a sex object, but I do like her anyway. Kind of the when Harry met Sally kind of motif, right? The age-old question of whether women and men can just be friends. And certainly there's allowance for that in other cultures, in the distant past and even, in today's world. Now, you did talk about women kind of laying that animus on men, and that's actually the other question I was going to ask you. Is this idea of sort of prejudging the aura of the other gender as being somewhat destructive, or kind of pigeonholing it into one representation, really a gender-specific thing? Because from my perspective, it seems like women do that to men a lot also. So is this really just a human thing, even though it may present itself in different trappings, perhaps?
Definitely different trappings, and definitely women are dealing in the same, in many ways, impoverished archetypal culture that that we are. I will say one thing, and this is just my own observation. I think by and large, my own experience, women are able to do a better job at disentangling the man from the archetype. They may be able to say, oh my gosh, he's so like Johnny Depp, Pirates of the Caribbean, but he's also this kind of a person. Whereas for men, I think it's easy for us to just get it all mixed up in one ball. We can't really see what's the archetype that we're playing on the woman and what is her own character that's being expressed. I've got no science or data on that point. That's just my own perspective of how things are based on what women have told me, and also what women have told me about other women and how they see men in their lives. They recognize an archetypal component, but they can see a person more easily as different than the archetype. Whereas for us, it's just one ball.
That's fascinating. Wow. And I think it's worth some thought, some internal reflection on our part. Hey, how do we view women? Do we view women kind of with this uniform standard of measure through one lens, as it were, where, they're all alike, as opposed to women maybe being able to flex a little bit on that? Although I will say I do hear a lot of women saying, oh, men are alike. I don't know. I guess it's just a matter of our evolution, how much time we spend thinking about relationshipy stuff. And I would probably tend to agree with you in that women probably think more in terms of the depth of relationshipy stuff than we do, and perhaps either sideways or directly arrive at some of these same conclusions you're talking about. Whereas men can be a little bit more binary about it. I think that's fair. But one thing that's for sure, this is one heck of a deep topic, and I'm sure you elaborate upon it massively in your book. So that's what I want to do right now, is point guys to Savage Breast, One Man's Search for the Goddess, by going to www.mountaintoppodcast.com/goddess. where they can find more about that particular book and also about Changemakers books at large and some information about you too. So once again, it's mountaintoppodcast.com/goddess to get you some. I will also add Tim Ward's book to the top of my queue at mountaintoppodcast.com/Amazon, where you can find not only his books, but books from other guests as well. That's there for you, and so much more at mountaintoppodcast.com/Amazon. Tim Ward from Bethesda, Maryland, thank you so much for what was such a deep, intelligent, and thought-provoking conversation, man. There were some revelations here. Thank you.
And my pleasure, Scott. And I wish to all your listeners all the best in really finding the woman you can love and seeing her deeply and clearly for who she is.
Yeah, that's an important point that you just made. We want to leave this conversation with optimism, not pessimism. My hope and trust is that we'll all feel better prepared for our relationships with women in the most positive light possible, really having shown that light on all these different angles and archetypes that perhaps we don't get to think about much in this culture. So good stuff. Gentlemen, please head over to mountaintoppodcast.com if you haven't done so lately. I'm talking to more and more of you guys. Listen, when you sign up for 25 minutes free to talk to me, it won't cost you a dime. Even if we go over 25 minutes, it still won't cost you a dime. You'll find I'm exactly the guy you expect me to be. I don't play a fictional character on this show for by any measure. Expect an authentic, real conversation between us about where you are right now and where you want to be. And I may most likely be able to relate to you in many of those ways. And I look forward to talking to you if I've never spoken to you before. I always like getting to know you guys who listen to this show. You're invariably wonderful guys with a lot going on and a lot going for you. Many of you just need to find the right woman in your life or get on the track where you're finding a string of the kinds of women you really want and getting them into your life. And, if this show didn't give you a lot of food for thought and getting that part of your life on track, I don't know what would. So definitely go to mountaintoppodcast.com, sign up to talk to me free for 25 minutes. And I look forward to talking to you indeed very soon. And also, while you're at mountaintoppodcast.com, please visit our sponsors, Origin in Maine. Jocko Willing's company will outfit you with the best jeans and boots you've ever had. Everything is 100% American made. Gotta love that. Also, fantastic protein powder and supplements that really work. Your body absorbs them. They're high quality supplements. You will feel, let's just lay it on the line. You'll feel like a new man once your body is being empowered and nourished correctly. Remember, Origin Labs is the fuel that fuels Jocko Willink himself. So there's something to be said for that. Also visit our friends at herosoap.com. You can get body wash or bars of soap from them, along with some other cool things they've just added to their product line. The scents are amazing. They're masculine. They will make you smell clean and fresh. Women love it. If you have not bought some of the body wash and reserved it for those times when you take a shower with a woman in your life, boy, are you missing out. And that's all I'm going to say about it. Go to mountaintoppodcast.com, click on the links for our sponsors there, Origin in Maine and or herosoap.com. And as always, you can use the code MOUNTAIN10 with either of our sponsors for an additional 10% off. And until I talk to you again real soon, this is Scott McKay from X and Y Communications in San Antonio, Texas. Be good out there.
The Mountaintop Podcast is produced by X and Y Communications. All rights reserved worldwide. Be sure to visit www.mountaintoppodcast.com for show notes. And while you're there, sign up for the free X and Y Communications newsletter for men. This is Ed Roy Odom speaking for the Mountaintop Podcast.